Welcome to the Healthcare Nation podcast. Your host, Rick Gannotta, here with our producer, Joe Woolworth. Joe, how are you doing as usual?
Doing good. I'm doing good.
Good to see you. We've got a big show today, things that are new and noteworthy, and obviously some of them are pressing and urgent, like our show today.
And we got some stuff to talk about.
We do. The assassination attempt on former President Trump and its implications. The announcement last night on the RNC platform of JD Vance as the VP nominee with former President Trump.
Currently, as we're recording this, it's the second day of the convention.
And lastly, as we promised our audience, we're going to really recap the debate, right? The Biden-Trump debate, and go over that, specifically honing in on some issues, obviously touching on cognitive performance and what it takes to be at the helm. So, all that said, let's just jump in.
Welcome to the Healthcare Nation podcast. We're committed to bringing you thought leaders in the field to discuss what's new and noteworthy in the healthcare sector. Now your host, Rick Gannotta.
Let's go over the assassination attempt. First, details of the incident. Last Saturday, July 13th, at a campaign rally near Butler, Pennsylvania. This is part of Trump's campaign efforts leading up to the 2024 presidential election. There was an attempted assassination, right? Former President Trump was wounded with a shot to his ear, the bullet missing by millimeters, what would have probably been a fatal, mortal wound. There's no doubt about that. He took cover and clearly got out of there. But tragically, one rally attendee was killed. 2 others were seriously injured as well. This is terrible. This is obviously something that we don't want to see happen to anyone in any realm of political life, because it undermines the process. What do we know about the shooter, 20-year-old who had not undergone security screening? He was outside the rally's secure perimeter. Not much known that we could report on at this point, but we got to consider all potentialities. And I always also include the fact that what was the mental state of mind of this individual?
Sure.
We see that so many times with these, I'll just put it out there, young, disaffected men.
Yeah, surprisingly young, it seems.
Surprisingly young, 20 years old.
And if you saw his pictures, he looked like a young 20.
A young 20. And whether, there's whatever the motivation, it's still being uncovered. That's not what the show's about, but we're just, putting the facts out there.
And they may never find out the motivation.
We may never.
But yeah, I agree. It's terrible. Sad that it happened. Biden came out, condemned it. Obviously, there's no place for violence. I thought it was kind of classy that he took off all the negative ads for a bit.
Yeah, and a lot of folks dialed it back, as they should. Following up, though, there were security lapses, weren't there? I think at the very least, we know that attendees were screened for weapons. There were counter sniper teams. Thank goodness they did their job. Many would argue whether they did it within protocol or not. We know that because there were still shots fired. Were there security lapses? We don't know. There are going to be investigations, responses, et cetera.
Talk about the close call you were mentioning earlier. I don't know if you saw the photo. I think it was USA Today or maybe Atlantic, or it was one of the bigger magazines, had a still where the bullet trail was about this long.
Right. They had it that close.
It was right next. I mean, it was right here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said, millimeters. And anyone, and I think folks know, I've got a clinical background. This was incredibly close. I mean, there was no doubt about that. And let's not forget that the former president was shot. That's just a reality. So let me just put some things out there. This is the Healthcare Nation podcast. And I thought about this, and the health of a nation really, it extends beyond what we think of. We mostly go to physical components of health, maybe mental, but there's also moral, social, psychological state of its citizenry. And one of the things I want to call out, specifically is what's happening with our political and social fabric and the erosion of trust. And I'm going to go back to really the debate and the fact that the downplaying of President Biden's health was really highlighted by the debate and his performance there. And this emphasis really called out what I think right now is some impersonal nature of the presidency. And this indicates a deep problem. And that what it creates, I think, is this growing mistrust in transparency and accountability. Anytime leaders are perceived as distant and opaque, and by the way, I'm talking about the president here, but it could be CEOs of corporations, et cetera. And if you have stockholders and a governing constituency, when the bond between the government and the governed weakens, that erodes the social contract. And that is fundamental to a healthy society. So I want to put out there, when I think about political and social fabrics, it starts with trust. The second piece is this dehumanization of political opponents and the normalization of what I would say rhetoric, specifically violent rhetoric.
Yeah.
It really does reflect a moral crisis. When candidates are reduced to symbols of hate, it becomes easy to justify violence against them. Doesn't matter what your politics are, this is moral decay, and it undermines the certain principles of obviously respect, human dignity, fuels conflict, diminishes our ability for civil discourse. It erodes all of that, which are essential for a functioning democracy.
I have a bit of a hot take in agreement with what you're saying, but I think when it comes to the rhetoric, and it seems like I've noticed in people I know that the rhetoric now has extended to things that aren't political in a way that is almost like a separation with a bit of reality. Like it's one, it's never as bad as they're saying, or two, they'll blame whatever candidate they don't like for anything bad that happens because it happened on their watch.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything from, the death of a family member to the fact that they don't got groceries are more expensive than they used to be. It's that candidate's fault because it happened on their watch, which is like you said, it's just a disconnect because it's not true.
Yeah.
Well,
I think, look, this is when we think about the shift from, and I want to frame it up a little differently. Historically, there was policy-based politics. It shifted to identity-based politics.
Right.
And this includes societies, individuals really grappling with insecurities about their future, themselves, et cetera. When you frame political battles as these existential threats, it really does exacerbate fear, anxiety. It just becomes something that to a lot of individuals, it is a matter of their own personal identity and ultimately their survival. And it does drive a lot of extreme rhetoric and some measures. And I would just say this too, we don't want to see it reduce everything down to a zero-sum game where there is no room for compromise. That is really, it doesn't serve anyone well. There's no doubt about that, right? When we think about it.
And I think hopefully one reason to be optimistic is anytime there's a tragedy, and I think the assassination attempt of an ex-president is a tragedy, it does seem to bring Americans together, and hopefully we get to experience some of that in the next couple of weeks.
We hope that, and we shall see. But I will tell you, let me just stay on the theme. I don't want to forget that, and we talk about it a lot here, right? The source of truth. What is the source of truth? But I also say that the influence of social media, the dominance of voices, many times very bombastic voices, right? Skews public perception and really inflames a lot of passions. Now, why is this? I think because journalism, and it doesn't matter, you could turn your TV on, it is polarized. We know this. We know the difference between CNN and Fox, or MSNBC and Fox, et cetera. This is just a reality. So where do you go? And when the default is social media, the quick, really viral spread of so many views, right, including extreme views, tends to distort everything, including a reality, and it undermines rational thought and I think deliberation, that context for, a conversation.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head when you said when it becomes about it's my identity, you can't have a debate anymore because now you're attacking the person. It's the difference if you've ever had the argument with your spouse. You're like, hey, I didn't call you a jerk. I said you're acting like a jerk. It's like splitting hairs, but at the same time, it's a huge difference in a marital fight. And I think when you can't have a debate any longer because disagreement about a simple thing that your party might have a strong political take on, like fair housing, let's say, becomes a personal attack on you because you believe and side with this party that thinks this thing, it just shuts down like rational conversation.
It does. And you know this. But look, how do we get on the other side of this? How does this come together? You were just saying it. Hopefully there's a moment to step back. A healthy nation, right? When we think about the healthcare nation, it requires, I think, first and foremost, leaders who are accountable, transparent, who communicate, foster trust, cooperate, really look to their constituents, I think, for direction, but understand that they're ultimately the government for all the people, whether they're in the position or in the process of being elected. And when we encourage this respectful dialogue across political, divides, it's a place to start. We've got to do that, restoring that humanity in that, the common values, the fact that at the end of the day, the collective well-being is the collective well-being of all Americans, right? Not exclusive of any one party or not. So,
and I think if this conversation makes you uncomfortable, let me throw out a challenge there. The idea of like, if you can get behind that idea, if he's not my president, whichever party it is, then you're probably in that camp where it's become your identity because he is, or she is. We got one president at a time. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so to disconnect from the reality of what's going on and say, well, not mine. Oh man, that's a dangerous place to be. And you might be in that camp where you might need to, challenge your own thinking on stuff a little bit.
Yeah, including the process, right? Meaning our Constitution, and I think everything the Republic was built upon, the democratic processes that are in there, and the fact that, look, vote. I mean, that's the other side of it. I mean, putting it out there. So along those lines, let's pivot a little bit.
Let's talk about policy.
There was big announcements. I think the number one announcement at the RNC convention was former President Trump's VP pick.
Yeah, what feels like a very young man.
He is a young man. Yeah. By the way, folks may mistake you for JD Vance.
Oh, yeah. I haven't seen much of the coverage.
There's a little bit, yeah. But let's get into the background of JD Vance,
sure,
and talk a little bit about what's happening with, specifically, obviously, we talk a lot about healthcare policy views, the health sector. So what do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I think we know a lot about people's policies based on their voting record and stuff. So let's just start with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. What's his views
these
on
are
that?
the biggies. So what I could see, right, the bottom line, he's expressed support for reducing costs in Social Security, right? Hopefully the background there is to keep it solvent. Medicare as well, and Medicaid, focusing on sustainability of these programs. So I like the fact that there'd be sustainability. We'll see what the methods are that go into that. His past support really was aimed at cuts that align with broader fiscal conservative agendas that have been out there. We could look at that in the voting record across the board. He does emphasize a lot on the need to combat fraud, both in the Medicare space and Medicaid space, comprehensive audits in those areas, obviously leveraging advanced technologies like AI and ML to enhance fraud detection and prevention. He worked, I think, on a bipartisan effort, in fact, to advance issues along those lines. So I can't get into a lot of depth on that, except that I believe there's a commitment for solvency, but also the reality is, and maintaining Medicare and Medicaid, but there's got to be a focus on sustainability of the programs across the board. He's going to take a conservative approach to that.
So maybe get a little bit more granular here. What do we know about his stance on single-payer healthcare?
Yeah, well, look, he's, certainly we'll get into his background with respect to venture capital and private equity, et cetera, but he is into free markets. He opposes single-payer healthcare, argues it could lead to increased government control, reduce quality and accessibility, competition. Obviously, he is, as I said, into market-driven solutions and innovation within the healthcare sector. So I think we could stand on the fact that that's the direction he's going to go with respect to single-payer, approaches.
Another thing I think people might be interested in is he was vocal on some of his stance on COVID-19 mandates.
Yeah. I think he was a loud voice, emphasizing, consistently personal choice in healthcare decisions, opposed mandates with vaccines, criticized the COVID-19 mandates, including the passport, approach and mask mandates. So he's been,
and he was critical during COVID-19 or after?
Yeah, I think both. I think that's the reality. He's been fairly consistent across the board, so there's no doubt about that. And in retrospect, we see that a lot of this, he's probably on the right side of the issues. So depending upon
in hindsight, you got that benefit now. That's why I asked.
Yeah.
How was he feeling during it?
I think he's been fairly consistent with this. Yeah.
What about prescription drug pricing?
Yeah, advocates for reducing prescription drug prices. We know that in Trump's first term, he pushed this. Biden advanced it. It makes good political sense. How do they go about this? Increasing transparency, competition within the pharma industry, policies on making them affordable. He's been very, I think, supportive in this realm with what obviously Trump started in his first administration, what Biden has continued. I could see him advancing this.
Yeah. What about work requirements?
Yeah. With respect to Medicaid, I think he's been fairly consistent on eligibility, revolving around requiring some work component. Personal responsibility is a big part of his platform. Reducing dependency on government assistance is part of that. So I could see this going hand in hand. Obviously, it's a state issue. I can't get into his record in Ohio. I just don't have that information. But I think we can say with confidence he's going to push more along the lines from a policy perspective of, this work requirement for eligibility.
Yeah. Certainly during COVID-19, we saw an increase in the need for mental health funding, and we've got this social shift as it's becoming more acceptable for people to seek help in that regard.
Yeah.
What about Vance's policy views on mental health funding?
Yeah, he's been consistent with funding for mental health research and treatment. One thing I do like, he takes an approach that is focusing on the individual. We'll call it the patient or the person. That personalized kind of focus versus giving subsidies to organizations like pharma. But he has stressed the importance of comprehensive mental health services. So we shall see how that kind of declares itself.
What about the VA, Veterans Healthcare?
Yeah, always an important topic. He wants privatization in veterans healthcare. By the way, he served in the Marine Corps, I believe, in Afghanistan. So he is, I think, very attuned to this, right? He introduced a bipartisan bill to expand TRICARE access for retired National Guardsmen, options for those who served to receive benefits that they deserve upon early retirement. I think he's on, the right side of making sure that, number one, for veterans, that there's access to healthcare, but looking at the role of privatization and competition and how that could play a part, hopefully in giving better care.
So the next topic, do you think he's a little bit off of the company line with his party when we're talking about his views on legalization of marijuana?
Yeah, I think if you go back in his record, I want to say although he's a Republican, I think he has a little bit of a libertarian streak in there. He supports with respect to marijuana legalization, but with taxation and regulation, right? So it's interesting.
Who's
but
not
the
taxation?
Yeah, that it's more of an effective approach.
I haven't heard of any politician being like, yeah, legalize it, but don't pay taxes.
Right.
That's
but I think he's seeing it as this is a better, approach than criminalization. So that was refreshing to see.
What about a stance on Obamacare?
Obamacare, listen, he opposes Obamacare, right? The Patient Protection Affordable Care Act. Believes it imposes excessive regulation and cost for the healthcare system. As I said, he's into competition. You could argue that impedes it when you look at something like Obamacare and the governmental aspects of it. He's been fairly consistent with his opposition to this.
And finally, views on abortion.
Pretty straightforward with this. He is staunchly anti-abortion, believes that it undermines social values, societal values. He supports, I think, measures to eliminate it altogether, including creating pro-child, pro-family, approach with respect to values that I'm sure we are going to see in his policy agenda as he moves forward through the campaign. We shall see.
Do you get a sense of, or would you care to venture a guess? Most of the time the VP will get a side project or something that's kind of like their stump thing, their contribution, what they're doing in the meantime kind of a thing. Do you think healthcare related issues might be something that he would be interested in pursuing as his? Yeah,
that's a great, let's think about that. I think, look, he is a fiscal conservative. I think he would be supportive of targeted interventions in healthcare, but he's open to market-driven solutions. How would that play out? I really don't know. If we take a look at his Senate voting record, right?
Yeah.
He's been, as we said, with respect to abortion, et cetera, right to contraception act, he's been very, clear with his opposition to that. He's also supported measures to enhance, seniors' care with cardiovascular diseases and medical supply chain shortages. So it's possible. I think the bigger piece when you think about a pet project would be what he did in Silicon Valley and in venture capital. He has significant experience in Silicon Valley. After he graduated from law school, he went to work for a firm that was founded by Peter Thiel. I think it was called Mitchell Capital. And he also co-founded his own firm that focused on investing in companies that were outside the traditional tech hubs around the country. So I don't know. I know that he supported innovative technologies, different approaches, market solutions. Look, he wrote a bestseller too, right? I mean, Hillbilly Elegy made into a HBO movie or a TV movie. So we'll see. I think he's a young, very capable individual. So probably could go into a lot of different policy
we
areas.
talked in depth about like the idea of there seems to be more of an emphasis on things that are market driven, consumer driven in the healthcare space. So it could be an interesting couple of years.
Could be a fit. I would see if you have a potential candidate who is into competition, right? The free markets, innovation, technology, has deep understanding of the platforms that are successful in commercializing ideas, knows Silicon Valley really well and the players there. He could definitely fit there. Now, don't forget, he's got a military background. He's a lawyer. He's got a lot, I think, areas where he could check the boxes off being competent in a variety of different areas. So we shall see. The other thing I would say, Joe, and I don't want to pass over this, and this is my observation. If you go back to Silicon Valley years ago, let's say early days of Apple and Steve Jobs and others, I think in general it was a much more liberal environment. If you take a look at today, it is becoming very conservative with respect to some of the voices that are out there. I'm not speaking, specific. I'm just saying in general, when you think about a lot of the folks who are supporting Trump second term and go around and JD Vance, his connections out there, it's very interesting to see. So we'll see how that plays out.
And him, like most people in his party, were at a time pretty anti-Trump.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot in there about his own record of speaking against.
Which honestly, I talk to a lot of people, and this is a generalization because it's not statistically accurate, but most people that I speak with, and I think if you're honest, you probably have at least felt this, that most people are like, can we just get somebody that's in the middle of the road?
Yeah.
Instead of somebody that's all the way right if you're voting right, or all the way left if you're voting left. And do you get the sense that this guy is middle of the road? We keep saying the word fiscal conservative, which is pretty traditional Republican speak, but they haven't, in a lot of cases, I don't think they've really been acting as fiscal conservatives. And you see the Democrats kind of starting to take on some of that fiscal.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I would say this, I think the folks who are left out the most is the middle. Right. If you look at the extremes right now of both parties, the middle is left. And these are the folks who decide the elections. Yeah. Right? It really is. The independents also, but I would say the folks who are true centrists who are out there, Reagan Democrats or Clinton, Republicans, that kind of thing. I think that if I was to couch JD Vance into speaking to that right now, no, because his policies look at it with whether it's contraception and reproductive rights or how he's approaching, just fiscal issues across the board, his thoughts on Ukraine and where that's going. Sure. I think that it is much more aligned with where the Trump constituency has been and not in the center. But he could very well be, positioning himself, obviously, to be the VP candidate of choice, which he successfully has acquired that role. And now we'll see how that develops. But if there was anything, this points to is if there was a succession plan for Republican leadership moving forward, he is so young. obviously well-educated, has strong views on many different things. He's probably the face of the future Republican Party moving forward. I would say that with, I think, some degree of certainty.
So this has been very refreshing to actually talk about issues.
Yeah.
But we promised we were going to talk about the debate. And unfortunately, I felt like watching the debate, every time they would ask a great question about an issue, I would be sorely disappointed in the answer.
Yeah.
We didn't get to a lot of issues.
Yeah. So listen, we promised our audience, folks who watch us on YouTube, that we were going to cover the debate. Obviously, there was a lot that came in that we wanted to cover today, but we're getting back to the Biden-Trump debate. We don't want to call it analysis. It's just our observations, right?
Sure.
You and I, and how we think about it. But one thing that we know for certain, if you take a look at it objectively, factually, there was two different stories happening. One was the clear cognitive issues that President Biden had. The other was the accuracy of what former President Trump was saying. Right? The truth in that. And that was a reality.
And one, Biden claimed to prepare for weeks. And Trump was like, I didn't prepare. And one of the things I found funny going into the debate, like if you watched any of the pre-debate stuff or just paying attention to American politics, the bar was pretty low for both candidates.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was like, hey, if Trump could not be mean and be presentable.
Yep.
And then if Biden could just string sentences together without problems.
Yep.
And I think both of them kind of didn't hit the mark of the very low bar assigned to
low
them
bars
by both sides.
But if you take, but post debate, right? We know this polling data, and I'm not going to quote this accurately, and I want to be accurate, but I think it's better than directional. There were significant concerns about President Biden's performance. They revolved around his cognitive performance across the board. Did that, that outweighed the accuracy, or folks want to call it the lies that Donald Trump was saying? Yeah, it did. That's just a reality.
Well, here's the problem with that particular comparison, right? You can't tell if somebody is a gifted orator if they're lying unless you know.
Yep.
And it's like watching American Idol. Like I might not be able to sing, but I can sure tell you who the stinkers are from the audition process.
Yeah.
You can see when somebody's struggling with speaking because we're just all wired to be like, oh, he's having a hard time.
Well, the other piece is this. If someone is inaccurate or tells a lie and you're debating them, hopefully you have the cognitive wherewithal to say, hey,
that's a lie.
That's a lie. I'm going to call you out on it. And I'm going to, right? And that is in debate 101, rhetoric, that's the way you win points. That did not happen. That was a failure.
I saw Chris Wallace on Bill Maher, and he was talking about that point, basically mentioning that the stuff that Trump was saying about how immigrants, they get money and they don't have to pay taxes. And he was like, that wasn't true. And what disappointed Chris Wallace was the fact that Biden didn't just say that's not true.
Yeah. And this, right, this is the big, I think it's the elephant in the room, right? I mean, you want to have a president or you want to have a candidate who could hold their own in a debate because the issues impact policy, the agenda, what's going to happen for the next 4 years, all of that. And we didn't see that. So there was two things at once. Really, there was, first of all, if you could say these were inaccurate, however, whatever your problem, I'm not going to weigh in on that. But if there were lies, they were not, there was not a counter to them. There were no countermeasures that were deployed to say that's not true.
And it wasn't the job of the people moderating the debate to do that. And I think that's what the challenge is.
Yeah, and I think the rules were against, well, I think the Biden administration, they set the rules, right? Trump agreed to it. It ended up backfiring, I think, to put it mildly. There's no doubt about that. But, it calls into question, what happens with leadership and cognitive decline? I can say this, I've been the CEO of pretty significant and high-performing health systems in the country. And if we had a surgeon or a physician who did not have the cognitive wherewithal to go into the surgical suite and perform surgery, there would be measures to stop that individual.
Sure.
Right? There's no doubt escalation of chain of command, that kind of thing. You don't let it happen.
Absolutely.
Right? That's one extreme. I'll just say that from my own personal experience. The other side is if you were going out and you said to someone, I want you to watch my 3-year-old kid or my grandson or my dog, you'd want them to have certain capabilities, or will you drive to the store?
Sure.
That's called setting the bar low. And if we want to start there with the president's cognitive ability, you hope that you'd be able to say, sure, I'd be comfortable with this individual driving, et cetera.
Yeah.
And this is where I think you've got to be realistic about, number one, expectations around what we expect from leadership. 2, the folks they surround themselves with and their comfort with truth to power. And then 3, the controls that are in place to really step in and say, this is not the case, because you don't want there to be a call at 3 a.m. if I have a president who works, 9 to 4 and there's a crisis.
Also, I was a bit disappointed in that there was no acknowledgement of that last point you were making. Like, I felt like he could have said, well, I'm going to surround myself with good people. We don't need our president to be the best debater. That's not a skill you need to be the best president. You do need to surround yourself with smart people. There was no like, well, I mean, you think about it in the corporate world, if you ask somebody a question and they don't know the answer, like a seasoned leader will be like, I don't know the answer right now, but I'm going to find it and get back to you because I think it's an important question. There's none of that. They both just seem to shoot from the hip.
Yeah, that's true. But in a debate, obviously, you can't do that. There's not, let me make a call or let me dial and get my save here. That's one. But 2, I think a bigger point is the buck stops with the president.
Yeah.
Right. We did not vote, aside from the vice president, we did not vote for his team.
Sure.
Right. And that is the big issue here. And that, I think, and that doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, that's the reality. And you do want a president, particularly in this day and age, who not only is going to deal with domestic issues, and we have a lot of them right now, but when you have, the Middle East and Russia and Ukraine and the Far East with China, you want someone who has a command of a lot, particularly when we've got servicemen deployed, servicewomen deployed, and a lot of nuclear weapons and a lot of hot spots around the world.
One of the tensions I was trying to manage while watching the debate is trying to figure out how to, one, have empathy for a guy that has a great track record, did a lot of good stuff, and trying to think about it like, okay, if this was my grandfather or my father, or, there's obviously signs of mental decline. And so you feel bad and you want to give the benefit of the doubt. And then the other side of that tension is like, but this is the president.
Yeah. We
should get the best candidate possible for both sides and present that to the American people. And I don't know, there was a lot to be disappointed with. Like, the debate started and like within moments, he's flubbing and missing. And, we're used to politicians saying a lot and saying nothing, but it wasn't that. It was just almost.
You're not saying it, but I don't want to speak for you, but I think gaps in cognitive performance, right? The ability to
starting a sentence, not knowing where it's going, and ending it in a spot that didn't make sense.
Right. And this is different, by the way, than stuttering, right? Which we know that the president has a history with stuttering. He's disclosed that himself. It's different than that. When you really look at, I don't want to diagnose things, but word losses and almost an aphasia type thing. We saw Mitch McConnell had freeze up issues. There were a lot of concerns with that when he was Speaker of the House. I think it's right that we called him out at that particular time. I think the same thing should be true with respect to the president. The stakes are much higher.
I think when you compare it to, you were making an analogy between the business world and a CEO. Imagine like in Steve Jobs in his prime, if he's getting ready to big WDC convention and he's launching the new product and he can't remember stuff.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't be the CEO.
He wouldn't do it.
And that's
right?
Apple.
That's
not the USA.
Right. Shareholders, right? I mean, there's no doubt the markets, I mean, there would be serious concerns. And I used the healthcare analogy earlier. There are some institutions, some academic institutions where they have, believe it or not, age restrictions. If you're a surgeon, you can't do surgery past 70. Although I think there may be exceptions. And it was blanket across the board regardless. And I think those are some of the things that when we look at, is it fair? Is it right? Now, we know this to be true, that it has probably less to do with age and more to do with aging and how the body, interprets that. I mean, there are young people in their 50s who have early stage dementia,
Right.
cognitive issues, et cetera. There's also folks who are incredibly effective, productive, and have a tremendous impact factor who are in their late 80s, 90s, and beyond that. I mean, this is a reality.
Sure.
So you got to look at it individually. And as I said, the stakes are high. And although I do want to say this for our audience, look, this isn't an analysis. I think what Joe and I are doing here was we're talking about our own concerns.
Yeah.
Right. You certainly don't want to cringe when you're watching someone
Sure.
come to a podium because you're afraid of what they might say.
And then unfortunately, like a week later, 2 weeks later, the next real public speech on camera, mispronounce a name.
Right.
Which, I mispronounce names. I can have some grace for that. But then when he
put in
called
the wrong names.
But
too.
then when he calls Zelensky Putin.
Yep. Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah. I'm sure President Zelensky.
He was gracious about it.
He was gracious. Yeah.
More gracious than he probably needed to be.
Right. Yeah. I'm surprised there wasn't more backlash on those. There was two specific.
Yeah. He called his Vice President Trump.
Right. Exactly. I mean, these are two things and on the heels of the debate.
That one he didn't catch. He caught the Zelensky error almost immediately, but he was halfway off stage and I bet he was greeted with 30 looks from his staff. Like,
yeah. Joe, I got to say that.
What did I do?
Things like this, and we've all seen it. We've had, maybe family members or close acquaintances or folks that we know. It usually doesn't get better. There's not a magic pill that really can turn back the clock in this respect. And there's also, it's almost like, the Kubler-Ross, the grief process. There's a lot of denial and then anger.
Almost gaslighting on the fact of the Democratic side. Like, he's fine, he's great. When he's in the room, he's sharp. And it's like, okay, come on. When are we going to have real talk?
I said it earlier. We talk a lot here about the source of truth. I do think that if there are failures, in the close circle of the president of not disclosing this, it's that transparency side or the media to say, he's sharp as a tack. I've seen him when there's a counterfactual or a counter, narrative that is, 180 degrees different than that, ultimately there's going to be a reckoning.
Yeah.
And when you're dealing with voters and the perceptions they have and the fact that they're going to have their hands on the lever in the ballot box, that is right. That's not right. That's reality. And why was there not an open debate, within the family, right? In this case, the Democratic Party, to say, look, here's a reality and let's put forth a candidate who could be more successful. I mean, that seems reasonable. It passes the reasonable test and rational.
And I don't think we're past the window of that happening, but who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right.
A lot of speculation.
Today it's the 16th. I mean, it is possible, although the clock
Other
is counting
nations
down.
run entire campaigns and everything inside of 2-week windows.
Now, the other side is there is tremendous, I think, momentum now behind the Trump candidacy and effort. Now JD Vance coming on board, and just the RNC lift that I think will occur. There's a lot for.
How long until the Democratic National Convention?
I think we've got it's just a couple months, right? I mean, probably a little more than 100 days before they have for someone to even get in there and campaign.
Sure.
But the reality is that we're right around the corner from, the DNC.
I personally would love it if we were able to, as a country, pull off a candidate switch, because then we could say factually we don't need to start talking about the election 3 years before it happens anymore. Can we shrink the window where it's all we talk about?
Yeah. I do think that would things have been different, and look, we're talking about the debate itself and a little and our individual analysis with respect to that. But if there was more disclosure, more transparency, and a Democratic candidate like Dean Phillips, who was, basically shut out early on.
Yeah.
Because he criticized President Biden's age and wanted to, have a debate, et cetera. It wasn't going to happen for him. Yeah. RFK Jr., whether you agree with his politics or not, he left the party and went independent.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't a lot of opportunity.
Today, interesting fact, I noticed that I saw a news story that Biden assigned him Secret Service detail.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
interesting days we're living in.
This is when again, part of that, the tragedy, this post-analysis, and the fact that, okay, now everyone gets Secret Service protection. Look, this is a volatile political climate. We just said, and I started with it, it shouldn't be that way. But while it's a reality, whether someone is a former president or a candidate, and when they're both, you better afford the best protection possible, right? If you're a candidate, particularly given the fact that it's such a loaded proposition, you better afford the best protection available. There should be no questions asked. Now, whether there's some bar that folks have to reach with, a number of potential ballot votes and folks' supporters state by state, that's a separate issue. But the reality is, starting from that perspective, I think is really, really important.
Yeah. I think back to just our commentary on the debate or non-commentary, I found it frustrating and not at all related to cognitive decline that when they ask a question, they didn't answer the question that they asked.
Yeah.
So they ask about what about families struggling to pay for childcare? Well, let's talk about immigration. That wasn't a question. Next question, I don't remember exactly what it was, but they just continued on with the border. And then it resulted down into name calling. And at this time, the debate switched. Joe's calling Trump a sucker and a loser, and Trump's looking composed and not being name calling.
Yeah.
Where in the 2020 debate, it was the other way around.
Yeah. And look, this is why when you take a look at things just degrading and going down, but back to your first point, I think that part of a political discourse, answer your question. Don't necessarily answer the person who's asking its question. So give them the answer that you want and you prepared for. So we see that a lot in politics.
Sure.
I think the reality is it true? Is it not true? That's one big thing, the facts associated with it. And the point that you said, I think that things just degrading down and it's worse than marginalized when it's there's no room for discussion and name calling.
Yeah.
There's just no room for that when you start calling folks out.
I think you can get incensed, but they didn't get incensed in a way that was about the issues.
Yeah.
I think you can be passionate and you can have a point of view, but to your point, who does it help to just result to name calling?
Yeah, I think there was over 50 million Americans watch that. Right? So that's one thing. And then obviously the millions of folks around the world watching this, including, adversaries and so forth. I think the real concern, at least that I have on this, is folks looking at that and saying, whoa, this is it. This is what it's down to these two individuals. So depending upon what side of the aisle you're on, these are your choices. And we didn't have enough opportunity, I think, to go through a more rigorous, vetting and competitive component, which is so important for, democratic society and elections. But probably more importantly, what role does, media play and positioning play and all of that? I mean, and including the RNC and the DNC. I mean, that's just the reality.
And I went into it with a cynical point of view. I'm thinking this isn't going to change anybody's mind.
Yeah.
But part of me thinks that if the candidates would take time to address their thoughts and what they're going to do, there's so many double haters / undecided that maybe it would move the needle a little bit, but not when they just answer the question that's their talking points. It's becoming very, I feel like as an American, happy to be an American, like our system a lot. Yeah. It's become very clear that both sides are issued talking points from somewhere, and then they just spit those out for the week until they get new talking points.
Yeah, well, I think that the important part is those talking points are usually informed by a policy, and the question is, what is that policy? And how will that be part of the agenda of a particular administration moving forward?
Yeah.
And how will that impact your life, your family's life, the communities that we live in, the society that we have? That's the reality, and that's what we have to think about. And I think, I certainly don't have a background in law or constitutional law, anything like that, but I have faith in the founding fathers' visions for the United States, and I'm hoping that holds through in our democracy. And probably more importantly that, and we've heard this a lot, that there's more room for discussion and debate and conversation.
Yeah, I think you're right on, Rick. It is informed by the policies, the talking points that come out. I think the thing that we're all kind of losing sight of when we make our identity our political party, and when our guy or our girl doesn't win, is, and again, this is a bit of a hot take, I like my government split. I like the House completely not run by the same people from the other side. And historically, the president just hasn't impacted your daily life that much. And I think the rhetoric, this from both sides, is so high, like you're saying. It's the end of democracy.
Yeah.
Well, we had a good run. The republic's over.
Yeah.
If this guy went, no, he was the president for 4 years.
Yeah.
And we're still a democracy.
Joe, two things come to mind. One is that this thought of the existential threat, it's clearly not healthy.
It's fear-mongering.
We talk about it from a mental health perspective, that kind of anxiety and what it fuels. It's just that rhetoric that needs to be dialed back.
And I think
there's no doubt about
I think
it.
the news media has a reckoning at some point for going too far and allowing that instead of doing what their job was, which is to tell you what happened.
Yeah, and it may have gone too far. It may not, there may be new forms, right?
Yeah.
We know the podcasts that are out there, and
Sure.
we talked about social media.
Yeah, I mean, the
There's
traditional
no doubt
nightly
about
news
that.
is almost gone, right? Like that trusted third-party source of like your local news that didn't seem to have a side, like that doesn't seem to have an outlet in today's world anymore.
Yeah,
There's still some
There's
people that might watch.
no Walter Cronkite out there anymore that I could see.
And even think about the lawsuits with different news organizations and their defense basically being like, we're entertainment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great default. But one thing I do, what you were inferring there is the balance of power.
Yeah.
And, when you think about the House, the Senate, right, the presidency, the Supreme Court, these are ultimately in the hands of voters in many cases, right? How that looks. And, I think that, at least in my mind, you want majority rule, of course, that's the way we have voting, but you also want the fact that there's recognition of the minority side within the constituency that those need. If it doesn't happen, then things can go sideways really, really fast. So you want to have that balance out there, and you want to have concern, and that I think has been one of the great features, and not a bug within our.
If you think
system.
about it this way, like you say, "Oh, Joe, I don't know that." Why do you like your government split? Because we're split.
Yeah.
And our government represents us.
Yeah. I mean, it's got to be.
So if one party has a completely different view of half of the country, I don't like the idea of them taking their 4 years and 8 years and running all the way down the path and destroying all the progress that the other side felt was made so that we'll do a pendulum swing and we'll come back here and we'll do that.
Yeah.
I like incremental slow.
Representative, for the people, by the people. I mean, this is really important, right? There's no doubt about that. And that's why there's got to be, this opportunity for, conversation. And I would say this as well. I was really pleased, and both President Biden and former President Trump acknowledged it, that they spoke after the assassination attempt. And that was good. That was a good thing. And you didn't hear.
Both sides said it was respectful and a good conversation.
And talk about a place to start. I'll take that as a place to start.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, listen, great show. Really tough topics and not easy for Joe and I to even think
It's
through
difficult
this.
to have a conversation about politics with how polarized everything is.
Yeah. But hopefully for our listeners and our viewers, we are the Healthcare Nation podcast.
Yeah.
And the Health in the Nation is part of that. So with that, Joe, till next time, my friend,
Till next time.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests are for informational purposes only and not associated with any companies or academic institutions. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts, as well as our YouTube channel, Healthcare Nation Podcast. And if you have any questions or want to contact us,